The wind came like an accusation across the ridge, a raking, cold thing that stripped the last yellow of the corn and sent the shutters banging like the thin hearts of a town. He rode into it on a tired mare, shoulders hunched, a claim chisel thumbed absently in one calloused fist. The deed to the little stretch of earth was warm in his breast pocket, its paper curled with travel and hope. The farm had been his map for a future he had not yet learned to draw. He told himself the house would be empty, waiting like a patient thing. He told himself he would sweep, light a fire, set his bed, and begin. Instead, when he pushed open the heavy door, heat and voices and the smell of stew met him. For women filled the kitchen like hearthlight made flesh, each of them taller than any ordinary woman, shoulders broad as gateposts, their hands big and sure with work. They moved with an easy choreography. One stoking coals, another mending a shirt with a needle that looked like a sword, a third carving slices of dark bread, the fourth humming low while grinding coffee beans between smooth stones. They wore boots that thudded on the plank floor, skirts that hung heavy with oil and harvest, and faces that measured him without surprise, as if they had expected intruders and weather and the precise shape of his jaw. For a long moment he simply stood, the door wedged against his back, and watched them. The room smelled of yeast and smoke and a woman's musk tempered by sweat. There were tools on the walls, a rifle above the mantel, a child's dungarees folded over a chair. A framed photograph showed a bunch of women in a field, smaller than they seemed now, laughing at something off camera. It was a house alive with hands and history. It did not belong to vacancy. One of them, taller than the others, hair piled high and threaded with wheat, straightened and looked at him across the table. Her eyes were slate, close-set and unblinking. "You claim the farm, do you?" she asked, and her voice was less a question than a statement. "Ah, yes," he said. His words felt small. Warm hands reached for the kettle but did not take it. The other women glanced at one another like four pillars that could lean if one wavered. He found himself wanting to apologize for his boots on their floor. "There's a storm coming," the woman said. "The road's washed. The bridges further down are a mess. You could try to go on, but you're a man with a mare, and tonight that mare would drown sooner than you would do anything else heroic." The corner of her mouth lifted. "It keeps you honest. The weather." He swallowed and laughed, but it was a dry thing. "I was hoping," he didn't finish. Hoping had the fragile sound of unattended embers. "I was hoping the house. This house isn't empty." The tallest woman folded her arms and the sleeves of her faded blouse strained across her forearms. "We live here. We've lived here longer than those city clerks who put your name on paper ever saw these fields." He thought of the deed in his pocket and the surveyor's stamp. "I filed the claim. I paid the fee. I worked for it." Pride flared, a bright, foolish thing. "My name's on it." A short woman, with a face like a weathered map and a laugh that came as if it had to be scraped free, put the kettle on the stove. "Paper don't feed you when the snow bites through your coat," she said. "You don't wake with it in your mouth and say mine. You wake with cold and think of wood and bread." The conversation collected itself around him like smoke. It was not an argument so much as an offering and a test. The four of them spoke, sometimes finishing each other's sentences, sometimes each one keeping a tight story safe in her own mouth. They told him, clipped and straightforward, that they had been on the place for 3 seasons. They'd planted the scraggly orchard, repaired the stone wall, chased off wolves and men with worse teeth. When the barn had buckled in the last windstorm, they propped it up with saplings and their own backs. They were known in the valley as the giants, women grown tall by work and by the way the world had agreed to wring them into that shape, and rumor had painted them monstrous in polite company. It was easier for merchants to tell good stories about outlaws than to describe the women who could lift a wagon as if it were an errant crate. Men on the ridge steered clear because their wives said so. Children told ghost stories that were actually gratitude and fear braided into one. He listened, and in the listening the claim in his pocket blurred into a rectangle of green that meant less than the smell of stew. Still, the legalities of things lived in him like a bitter tooth. "I can't just," he began. "You can stay." the shortest woman said suddenly, her voice like a bell. "But you sleep with us tonight." He bristled. The phrase landed like a stone in a placid pond, and ripples ran through him. His mind made the worst turns. Theft, cruelty, coercion. The room tightened. He read something in their faces. No, not hunger. Rather, a flat necessity. The tallest woman met his look squarely. "Not like the stories," she said. "You sleep in the same house. You keep your fire. You'll put your back to the wall and sleep with your clothes on if you like. We mean that you do not leave this porch tonight when the rain starts and the creek claws at the road. We mean we keep you on this side of the door until the storm has passed." Relief should have been simple. Instead, something stubborn in him refused to concede. He had come with his own plans, his idea of building a life where no one's rules but his own would hold sway. To accept shelter felt like admission of weakness. He saw himself small in the mirror of their offer. "Why us?" he asked, trying to hold the question practical rather than injurious. "Why not? Why not let me have my room? I can sleep alone." "Because this house keeps watch better when it is full," the second woman said. Her voice had the plain cadence of someone used to being obeyed by animals and children alike. "When one is asleep alone, thieves can slip in around the edges, and wolves smell fear like lambs smell milk. When a house is full, everything that comes to it is counted by 4 pair of eyes. Also," she added, and the corner of her mouth creased, "you snore like a trapped fox. Your sleep will wake you if you sleep alone." A reluctant laugh broke from him then, because the image of himself snoring was ridiculous and mortal and human. With that sound, a part of whatever granite had held him softened. He found the handle of the kettle, let it cool, and then set it aside. The woman with the needle watched, and her hands did not tremble. They gave him a corner of the main room, a pallet thick with straw and clean blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. The bed was narrow and he felt the draft on both sides, but they brought him a bowl of stew and a mug of warmed cider, and every movement was matter-of-fact. A woman pressed a bundle of newspaper into his hand to wipe the mud off his boots. Another hung a lantern over his pallet by a cord that made him feel less like an intruder and more like an accepted animal in a barn. They asked questions about his journey, his family, the debts he might owe. He told them about his brother who had died 2 summers past and a mother with arthritis. He told them how the farm had been in his mind a thing he could make whole, a place to start that would keep a future safe. They listened, sometimes with eyes on him, sometimes with eyes on the door, and when he finished each small confession they nodded as if tallying supplies. Night came with the patience of a tide. Rain hammered the windows with the kind of insistence that made the house sound like a living thing remembering its anger. Lightning stitched the sky into white fabric, and the wind kept trying to pry the world apart. He lay awake, listening to the women move through their rituals. A thread being pulled through fabric, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of their talk as they counted the ways the house could fail and planned fixes. Once, he heard them cross the floor to stand by his pallet and whisper over him. He felt the air change. There is a moment in every person's life when they surrender an idea. His had been the notion that solitude was an honor and that needing others was a failure. The admission did not call for fanfare. It simply crept in, steady as the rain. "You're awake," the tallest one said, sitting on the low bench at the foot of his pallet. Her boots made a dull sound on the boards. Despite her size, she moved with the soft care of someone who had had to shelter fragile things all her life. "You look like someone who doesn't sleep when the world is noisy." "I can't sleep," he admitted. The truth tasted like the cider. "I keep thinking the town clerk will come with a rope and evict us. They'd have to find us first," she smiled then, small and almost private. "People like to think the law is large and tidy. It isn't. It is a book and a habit. Habits are easier to change than clutching to paper. Keep your deed in your pocket and your head on your shoulders. If a man came with a rope, he'd find more than a woman to deal with. The image of 4 women larger than any rumor and 4 pairs of hands that could take a rope and make it into something useful steadied him. He realized then that the price they asked was not some measure of humiliation but of solidarity. They were not demanding his body. They were asking for his presence. the joining of a life to their life in the way storms make neighbors of strangers. It was, he understood, the oldest barter. Shelter for watchfulness, hearth for labor, shared sweat for mutual steadiness. "Tomorrow," he said, and his voice shook less, "I'll go to the clerk. I'll make sure I'm in order." "No hurry," the woman said. "We fix things for ourselves here first. The law can wait until the creek backs down. For tonight, the only thing pressing is the storm and keeping the doors shut." He closed his eyes. The rain kept beating. The women kept moving like quiet sentinels. In the small dim of his palate, surrounded by the noise of a house that would not let him be isolated, his shoulders eased. It was a human thing to be held among others, an animal truth buried under his pride. He felt it uncoil, modest and vast, and he let it. When he woke, dawn was a pale thing that smeared the clouds into blue-gray watercolor. The rain had thinned to a whisper. In the kitchen, the women were already at work. Boots by the hearth, coffee being brewed, bread being torn and buttered with hands that had no idle motion. They welcomed him without ceremony, as if he had been here always. "You did well," the needlewoman said, folding his coat with care that made it seem like a possession worth keeping. "You stayed." "I didn't take anything," he said. "I didn't." "You were not asked to," the tallest replied. "You were asked to be here when the house needed you. That is all." Outside, the road was mud and new green, and the creek had swollen into a kind of silver snake that would take the better part of the day to calm. They walked with him to the gate, not as a favor but as a measure of kindness. Each of the women pressed something into his hand, an onion, a wedge of bread, a small knife with a blade that had been honed until it sang. "So you don't go hungry," the short woman said, "and so you remember who you shared your first night with." He left the farm that morning with the deed in his pocket and a strange, powerful gratitude rising like sun on the land. The claim would still belong to him on paper, but belonging had acquired a new definition. It would be not only what he had acquired but what he had not refused to accept. The women watched him go, tall figures against the field, waving as if he had been a boy leaving for school rather than a man setting off to legal wrangles. Behind them, the house huddled, full of the ordinary noises of life. He thought, as he walked, about the nights ahead and the easements of his stubborn heart. He had been forced, by weather and circumstance and the strict morals of women who had learned to survive by being larger than the stories told about them, to sleep under the same roof as those he would otherwise have kept on the margins. In being forced, he had found shelter not only from the storm but from his own small certainties. There would be more rain. There would be more chores that required 4 hands and more days when the town clerk would be less reassuring than a woman's laugh. But the farm had given him, in one sharp night, a lesson that would not fit on a deed. That some claims are made not by ink but by the willingness to stand at another's hearth and refuse to leave when the world gets loud. He carried that warmth like a small talisman. It would not be easy making this place his in the way that mattered. It would mean bending and learning and, perhaps, a humility that sat like good earth around a seed. He folded that thought gently into his pocket and stepped back onto the path, the house and its giants already becoming an outline against the sky, a place where, if the weather came for him, he would know where to return.